James Version says, "Thou hast possessed my reins." The first word formed means to create or to erect, but it also carries the idea of ownership. So God, by virtue of making us, owns us. We are not our own. The lordship of Christ encompasses every area of our lives. Now, when we sinned and in the fall that happened, this lordship was rejected. They looked for another lord, looking to make themselves number one. They instead ended up being number two to somebody else. And so by rebelling against this ownership, this has affected our world and how we live today. But technically, we belong to God because he is the creator. The King James Version, "Thou hast possessed my reins," brings in some of the concept of this, that the word formed also involves ownership, the possession there. Inward parts. In Hebrew thought, they talked more often about kidneys or digestive organs being the seat of emotions or the seat of thought, rather than, as we use terms today, like a broken heart. But we also apply emotions to other things. If we say, "My stomach's tied in knots," or "I've got butterflies in my stomach," or we have a gut reaction about something. So even the carrying over into English, we can see that some of this, we attribute emotional properties to our inner essential organs. So inward parts literally means kidneys in Hebrew. It refers to a general term of essential organs, but it also can encompass the fact of being the seat of emotions. So God has erected and created and owns both our body and our emotions. He knows all the details of what is in there and how that all functions. The next phrase, "You covered me in my mother's womb," or there's a footnote in my New King James Version that refers to it. Covered could also be translated as wove. In the NIV, the word is "knit me together." So we don't typically think of a covering and a weaving being the same similar word. But the word comes from a Hebrew word meaning to entwine together as a screen, to fence in, and therefore it implies protection, hence the covering. This is the same word that's used throughout the first part of the Old Testament for covering the Ark of the Covenant, when the Levites covered the Ark before they moved out of camp and progressed on. It also refers to the same word as the wings of the cherubim that were carved over that, covering the Ark of the Covenant. So here we see the implication of protection and care. The womb is also a safe place of protection, and the baby is ultimately covered by our Lord and by this protection. Also then with the uterine muscle fibers and how they actually do spirals, so that then when they contract, they can force the baby. It's not just a literal squeezing together, but it's moving the baby towards the opening of the womb. So if we look at this verse and add on to it, as we would say, "For you erected and created all of my essential mind and organs. You have covered and entwined me in a protective place, and you are also knitting me together within that place and weaving." Verse 14, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." These words are very close in English to the same word that we get in Hebrew. Fearfully implies appropriate fear with reverence and awe, and also encompassing somewhat of a dread as well. So when we look at, because we are made in God's image, we are to also treat others reverently and as we honor him. And how much more would that apply than to the little babies that are still not yet born, who are also made in God's image? So we need to have respect for God as our maker and reverently fear and awe him. We also need to have a certain amount of reverence, if you will, for our fellow man, also created in the image of God. Wonderfully means with distinction or marvelous. So we see some overlapping of the parallel structure is already coming in here, as we'll see marvelous in English in the next part of the verse. The word made or make, that's how similar to how we would use it in its broadest sense. It means we made something. It also encompasses, though, to bear, to bring forth, to prepare, to provide, and to maintain. So we can see how some of these connotations of the word would definitely apply to our birth process. Bearing, bringing forth. With preparing, God has prepared the womb. He has set up the whole process of the nourishment and sustaining of the baby and of the mother's reflexes and the baby's reflexes for how this all works. He provides for all of this to work. He maintains the baby. He nourishes the baby before it's born and after it's born. We also see that God, on occasion through the prophets, will use the synonym of a mother's care for her children to describe his care for us. But not to say that God is feminine, he still definitely maintains that fatherly relationship with each of us. So God has prepared our life and our calling, as we saw in the previous passages, that we were called from before we were born. Marvelous are your works. Marvelous means to separate or distinguish, to make singular. It involves things that are too high or too difficult for us to understand. It's the miraculous part of it. What is birth if not miraculous? We've seen how all of these sequences fit together, and as your speaker next month will address as well, that the mysteries that take place even before we get to the birth part. We also, the separating and distinguish, we mentioned before earlier, that's that same word, to sanctify, to make holy, to be separate, that God has called us out. He has called us out from the womb. He has made us holy and given us a purpose in life. To distinguish. We've heard the phrase that after God made you, he broke the mold. Each one of us is unique. We are fashioned in an own way, and we're separate. We're distinguished from everybody else that has gone through this process and given our own set of characteristics.